Growing up in a small town, everything was a lot simpler. Everyone knew each other's business, and it wasn't unusual for someone to wave at you from their front porch or for neighbors to gather for Sunday potlucks. But despite this warm, tight-knit community, I always knew I had to leave. I longed for something more. Photography had always fascinated me, but my parents had other plans. They expected me to stay on the farm, helping my father and older brother with the family business. Don't get me wrong, I loved the farm, the horses, the land, but something felt incomplete. There was a part of me yearning for something beyond the fields. My older brother, Alan, had always been the one who listened to me. He was 3 years older, and when he left for college, he did something that touched my heart deeply. He saved up from his part-time job and bought me my first camera. I can still remember the joy I felt when I held it in my hands. It became my constant companion, and I photographed everything in sight. That camera, the one my brother gave me, remains one of my most cherished possessions. School had been easy for me. I was a scholar, active in football, and with a scholarship, college was just the next step. It was there, in college, that I met Elena. She was stunning, with her blonde hair and piercing blue eyes. Her smile, it could light up even the darkest of rooms. She was on the cheerleading squad, and I could never help but notice her at every game. I was shy, she was shy, and so it took some time before we actually spoke to each other. But when we did, something clicked. We both shared a love for photography, and it became the bond that tied us together. When I finally asked Alina out on our first date, she hesitated, but then agreed. I was ecstatic. I'd never felt more nervous or excited. I wanted everything to be perfect, and I carefully planned out our evening. We went to a cozy little Italian restaurant in the heart of the city, the soft glow of candlelight creating a warm atmosphere around us. As we sat across from each other, I could feel the tension in the air, but it was a sweet kind of tension, one full of anticipation. I found myself mesmerized by her presence, her smile, the way her eyes sparkled in the flickering candlelight. It was the kind of evening where the hours seemed to slip away unnoticed. We laughed, shared stories, and bonded over our favorite dishes. The hesitation that had marked the beginning of the evening faded with every passing moment, and by the end of our dinner, we were lost in conversation, learning about each other's childhoods, our dreams, and the winding roads that had brought us together. Afterward, we decided to take a stroll through a nearby park. As we walked, Elena shared a secret with me, a truth she hadn't told anyone in college. She had a son, Harry, who was only 2 years old. My heart sank when she told me about how she had become pregnant at 16 with her then boyfriend, Nick. She thought Nick would be happy, but instead, he turned his back on her. Yet, despite everything, she refused to give up on her child. Her parents were supportive, and even Nick's parents sent child support regularly, but she cut off all contact with Nick after that. As Elena told me this, I could see the weight of her past in her eyes, the years of carrying this burden. She was afraid that her past might make me walk away. But as she waited for my reaction, I knew what I had to do. I reached for her hand, not a second of doubt in my mind, and told her that none of this changed how I felt about her. I admired her strength and her honesty, and I was all in, every part of her. Elena's face softened, her relief palpable, and I could see the gratitude in her eyes. She hadn't expected this reaction, but it was the only one I could give her. That night marked the beginning of everything. I didn't care about her past. It only made me admire her more. It didn't matter that she had a child. If Elena was this incredible of a person, then her son Harry would be just as wonderful. We continued seeing each other, and 6 months later, Elena introduced me to her parents. From the moment I walked into their home, I was treated like family. Their warmth, kindness, and hospitality were a reflection of who Elena was. I soon learned where she had gotten her strength and love. This was also when I first met Harry, the 2-year-old who would forever change my life. When he toddled into the room, his little hand reaching for mine, I fell in love with him immediately. I couldn't understand how anyone could abandon such a precious soul, but one thing was clear. If I was going to be a part of Elena's life, I needed to step up and be there for Harry. Elena never asked me to take on a fatherly role. She had her own support system at home, but I loved spending time with Harry. He was the most adorable child, with a smile that could melt anyone's heart. Being with him made me forget the stresses of my own life. And despite the difficulties of balancing school, football, and life, Elena always encouraged me to follow my passion for photography. So I joined the photography club in college. It wasn't easy, trying to juggle everything, but in the end, it opened doors to new opportunities and new friends. People who shared the same passion as me. When my parents visited me at college, I was eager to introduce them to Elena. I hoped they would see what I saw, the incredible woman I had fallen in love with. At first, they seemed to warm to her, but when I told them about Harry, their reaction wasn't what I had hoped for. My mom was stunned. "Are you dating a single mom in college?" she asked, incredulous. My dad couldn't believe it either. "Are you serious about this?" he asked me. I stood firm, telling them that it didn't matter to me. I loved Elena, and I loved Harry. They were everything to me. My parents tried to dissuade me, questioning my choice, but I didn't back down. Eventually, they gave up, perhaps thinking this was just a phase. After graduation, I made the decision to pursue a photography internship, despite my parents' disapproval. My dad called it too girly for me, but I laughed it off. Photography was my passion. Elena was fully supportive, as was my older brother. By now, he had settled back on the farm, helping our father with the land and the animals. My parents were proud of him. He was the son who followed in their footsteps, taking on the responsibilities they had hoped for me. But my path was different, and I was ready to take it. Conversation stepped in, his voice harsh and defensive. "It's just a suggestion," he muttered, his tone dismissive as if this was a trivial matter. But it wasn't just a suggestion. It was a blatant attempt to steer my life in a direction I had no interest in following. I stood there, my mind racing, trying to process what was happening. Was this really happening? My parents, who I had hoped might finally accept my choices, were pulling me into yet another web of manipulation. Elena, standing nearby, sensed the tension. I could see her eyes searching my face for a sign, a clue about what was going on. She knew me too well. Her silent strength was unwavering, but I could feel her disappointment too, mixed with confusion. She was watching the same scene unfold, and I could feel her hurt at how my family was treating us. My heart ached for her. As my parents tried to justify their actions, I could no longer keep quiet. "Why would you do this to me?" I asked, my voice shaking with frustration. "Why bring someone else into our lives? Why not just accept that I've built a family with Elena and Harry?" The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had built up over the years. My parents' faces hardened, their disappointment in me as sharp as ever. It felt like a betrayal, a cruel one. All the memories of our struggles, our journey to build a life together, now felt like they meant nothing to them. They weren't just questioning my choices, they were undermining the very foundation of the love I had fought for. Elena's hand found mine, her touch grounding me in the chaos. Without saying a word, she stood beside me, unwavering. But even her calmness couldn't stop the storm inside me from raging. I had never felt so alone, surrounded by family, but completely misunderstood. We didn't stay long after that. The tension was suffocating, and the facade of reconciliation fell apart the moment I realized what was truly happening. As we left, my parents' voices echoed behind us, trying to convince us to stay, to change our minds. But this time, I wasn't swayed. I had made my choice long ago, and no amount of manipulation was going to change that. I had a family now, a family that loved me, supported me, and accepted me as I was. As we drove away, the weight of it all began to lift. Elena squeezed my hand, and for the first time that day, I felt a sense of peace. We didn't need their approval anymore. We had each other, and that was more than enough. The conversation had barely begun when I realized something was off. "We need to speak to you privately," they said. Reluctantly, I agreed and followed them to a secluded room, leaving Elena to navigate the awkward glances of the curious guests behind us. The moment the door closed, my parents wasted no time. "Mark, we've arranged this meeting because we believe it's time for you to reconsider your marriage to Elena," my father declared, his voice dripping with authority. I was stunned. I couldn't believe my ears. How could they be saying this? My mind raced as they continued, explaining that someone with a better background than Elena would be a better match for me. Someone they could approve of who didn't already have a child with another man. "But I love Elena," I shot back, my voice rising. "We're married, and we're building a life together." "What made you think it would be a good idea to introduce me to her?" I asked, my confusion growing by the second. My mother remained unmoved. "We're only looking out for your happiness," she said. "One day you'll thank us for helping you escape this situation." Her words were cold, calculated, but my father's next words sent a chill down my spine. "Twelfth is divorced, so she doesn't mind marrying you if you can quickly get a divorce from Elena." I stared at them in disbelief. For a moment, I couldn't process what I was hearing. And then it hit me. The absurdity of it all. This felt like a bad soap opera, but it was real. My parents had invited me here, under the guise of mending things, only to pressure me into divorcing the woman I loved and marrying someone else. Someone they liked. "Seriously?" I said, trying to hold back the laughter. "You actually think this is going to work?" It was at that moment that my father, sensing my growing frustration, tried to justify their actions. "We've discussed this with your brother and his wife," he said, clearly defensive. "And they agree. Everyone thinks you made a huge mistake marrying Elena." That was the tipping point. I'd always respected my parents, always. But this was too much. I could feel my blood boiling. I had to raise my voice to get through to them. "This is embarrassing. It's hurtful. You're trying to break up my marriage and tear my family apart." As I walked out of the room, anger surging through me, I found Elena talking quietly with some of my relatives in the backyard. I leaned in and whispered, "We need to leave. Now." She looked shocked, but the look on my face told her everything she needed to know. She trusted me without a word. Despite my brother and his wife insisting we stay, I ignored them. I couldn't even look at my brother. He'd known about this plan all along and allowed it to happen. The betrayal cut deep. I didn't want to make a scene, so I quietly rescheduled our flight tickets, and we left. During the flight, I told Elena everything. She was just as shocked as I was, and like me, a little pissed off at the audacity of my parents. Thank you, everyone, for your support through all this. It's clear that what my parents did was out of line. But honestly, the real shock came from my brother. I've always been the youngest, the one who never really stood up to my parents like this. Sure, I knew they didn't like my wife, and I was okay with that. But to try to force me to leave her for another woman? That was despicable. But what hurt the most was that my brother was in on it. We'd always been close growing up. He'd always supported my decisions, my passions. I never imagined he'd betray me like this. He could have warned me. He could have given me a heads up, but he chose silence. It felt like a punch in the gut. The next day, after I'd had some time to cool down, I called him. Alan picked up, and I wasted no time confronting him. "Did you know about all this?" I demanded. He didn't even try to hide it. "Yes," he admitted, his tone unashamed. "I thought she was a wonderful woman who could make you happy if you gave her a chance." I was floored. "How could you say that? How could you and the family treat Elena and me this way? We've done nothing to deserve this." Alan's response was not what I was hoping for. He claimed that everyone just wanted me to be happy. So, I asked him, "What made you think I wasn't happy with Elena?" He hesitated before answering. "You need to face the fact that Harry will never be your real son," he said. "You need to divorce Elena, marry someone else, and start a family, someone who can carry on the family legacy." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My brother was more concerned about family tradition than my happiness, than the family we were building. He had become so influenced by my parents that he couldn't see past their wishes. We argued back and forth, and it became clear he wasn't going to support my marriage. "Maybe you should consider our perspective," he suggested, as if it was that simple. I couldn't take it anymore. I ended the call, but not without shedding a few tears. How had I gotten here? How had my own brother become so distant? I never imagined he'd betray me like this. And worse, he'd allowed my parents to tear my life apart. I knew then there was no changing their minds. If they felt this way, if my brother felt this way, there was no point in trying to make them understand. I had to let go of people who didn't want to be a part of my life anymore. I had to protect Elena and Harry. I wanted Harry to grow up surrounded by people who truly loved and supported him. So I made the decision. I was done. Done trying to mend something that was beyond fixing. Continued.